Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky, alongside our co-host, Dwight Brown. Hey, Dwight, how are you?
Hey, David, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Like always, we try and find the best guests to talk to you about what's going on in the world of HR and business. Today, we have with us a very special guest, Katica Roy. Hey, Katica, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very good. Katica, what's your role at Pipeline Equity?
I am the founder and CEO.
So tell us a little bit about Pipeline Equity and what you do for them.
So Pipeline is a software platform that increases the financial performance of companies through closing the intersectional gender equity gap, so gender plus race and ethnicity and age. We actually started with research. So we did research across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in intersectional gender equity, there's a 1% to 2% increase in revenue. And so what we do is actually enable companies to realize that gain through the decisions that they're already making, the people decisions. So internal hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion. We actually ensure that they're equitable before they make those decisions.
It is a phenomenal thing to do as well, not just to close the pay gap, but also I'm sure shareholders are saying, yes, 1% to 2%, we love it. And it's a great thing to do anyways. So before we get into our topic, Katica, what's the one fun thing that no one knows about you?
People know so much about me because so much of my life is public. People may or may not know this about me, but I grew up in Napa Valley, California. My parents had a winery, which they have subsequently sold. But when I was born, they were just starting that winery. So all of us were part of helping to plant the vines.
Oh, that's cool. It's very cool.
So you know a lot about grapes and the fruits that go into wine.
A little bit.
A little bit.
I know a little bit. I don't have a degree.
No, you don't.
You just planted them. You didn't learn about them, right?
Well, I wasn't even allowed to plant them. What my job was to take the milk cartons and to put that over the vines so that they're protected as they're growing. That was the job that I was allowed to do.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to take a video outside of my grapevines. I just love a little bit of assistance with making sure they grow appropriately. Okay.
I can connect you to some folks in Napa if you'd like.
That would be great. Yeah, that would be great. They're like, no, we're not going to use wine grapes from Boston, so that's okay.
Right. You don't hear that very often. Yeah, no, Boston grapes go into Boston this wine.
Yeah, doesn't sound like a winner to me. So today we're going to talk about something very special, and Katica gave us a little bit of a preview. We're going to talk about the economics of gender equity, and I'm really excited about this, given the fact that I'm an economist and I love pay. So our first question, Katica, is what does a gender economist actually do? It sounds like a really cool job.
Hi there, I'm Peter Zollman. I'm a co-host of the Inside Job Boards and Recruitment Marketplaces podcast.
And I'm Stephen Rothberg, and I guess that makes me the other co-host.
Every other week, we're joined by guests from the world's leading job sites.
Together, we analyze news about general, niche, and aggregator job board and recruitment marketplaces sites.
Make sure you sign up and subscribe today.
It is a cool job. So there are two things that a gender economist does. One is that they look at the economy through the lens of gender. So for instance, not this last jobs report, the one last Friday, but the one before that, if you look at that jobs report through the lens of gender, one of the things that we know is that there are still 812,000 women missing from the labor force since the beginning of the pandemic. And we have a 4 million worker shortage between the number of folks that are looking for a job and the number of jobs open. So if we brought those women back, we could actually close that gap by just over 20%. So those are the kinds of things that a gender economist looks at. The second thing that a gender economist does is to look at equity not as the right thing to do, though it is, but actually as a massive economic opportunity.
Sure.
So for instance, you mentioned pay. One of the things that we know is that we could actually expand the U.S. economy by $512 billion if we close the gender pay gap.
Wow.
Which is really important these days because, well, first of all, we have a lot of underemployment in those areas which you're talking about, but also that pay gap needs to get closed today or as soon as possible. I mean, obviously it won't be closed today, but as soon as is humanly possible.
Well, and we all pay for it. I mean, that's, I think, the thing that isn't often understood about the gender pay gap. There's often this assumption that it just impacts women. And that's actually not true. What we know is that the American taxpayer actually subsidizes the pay gap because when women aren't compensated equitably, they're more likely to rely on social welfare programs.
Yeah,
well, we all pay for that. So
right.
it's actually in our interest to close the gender pay gap. In addition to the fact that we could actually close the Social Security savings gap by a third if we close the gender pay gap. And that's because most women, from an income perspective, actually sit under that Social Security cap.
Wow.
So they're not paying into the extent at which it would close the gap.
That's right. That it would be more fully funded, or at least close the gap by a third.
That's interesting because these are the kind of statistics we don't hear about often. And so as you're talking about it, it's total news to me, but it makes total sense at the same time.
And so I'll go further on that. So, Katica, why aren't we talking about this more? Why isn't it part of the jobs report? And why isn't that part of what we hear about?
That's a great question. What I can tell you is that there are some outlets that do cover it. So, and I know because I'm on them. So, because they have me on to talk about it. So Yahoo and Yahoo Finance and Bloomberg, as well as MSNBC, in particular, Mika Brzezinski's Know Your Value. Those are outlets that do talk about it. More broadly, the reason why it isn't talked about as often in mainstream media is because we aren't lensing the information through intersectional gender equity, through gender, specifically through gender and race and ethnicity. Age is also an issue, but gender plus race and ethnicity. So, for instance, when the jobs report comes out, we'll talk about unemployment and whether unemployment went up or down. And we'll talk about maybe wages, and maybe we get a little bit one more step down in that data, like what industries gained or lost jobs, but we don't really get into the details behind the report. For instance, the unemployment rate is a rate. It's made up of two numbers, right? And it's either a good thing that unemployment is low, which means that fewer people are looking for work, or it's a bad thing because the labor force shrank. And when you begin to look at the numbers through gender, you can actually see the comparison of what does it look like for Black women? What does it look like for Latinas? From a job gain perspective, who is actually gaining jobs? So, for instance, we know in the July jobs report that men gain jobs at, I think it was like 7 times the rate of women. Those are things that we should be talking about. It's not good from an economic perspective for any gender to be left out. So I'm not just, this is not a rah-rah women thing, right? We don't want to leave men out either. We don't want to leave anyone out. But in order for us to do that, we have to take what's often called a gender mainstreaming approach, which is that we're actually looking at that data through the lens of gender. And that then informs policy, right? So whether that's the Fed or Congress or the White House, how we're actually looking at our policies and ensuring that those are actually equitable.
But I think it's also the state houses as well, because there's a lot of legislation that happens in the states that should be happening in the states. And I think, if I might double click a little bit on the Rubik's Cube that you're talking about, it's not just male, female. It's also people of color, women of color, who get significantly impacted and did get significantly impacted by the pandemic. And their level of pay is grossly under what even, if I can say that an advantage group in this case is white women.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so if we did double click a little bit and got to that second lens or that third lens, then that would actually enable at least the constituents, not just the state houses, because they should know this already, on who is actually getting disadvantaged or now who is actually trending higher from a the jobs report perspective.
Yeah, and specifically talking about women of color, that's why I say gender plus race and ethnicity and age, right? That's that. Right. When you actually look at that, it's 120 intersections of data.
Oh my gosh,
when you break that out.
Sure.
Right, but people can't even conceptualize that because, all those permutations, right? Their head would explode.
Yeah, well, that's why we created Pipeline. That's the beauty of technology and artificial intelligence. The one thing I will tell you is that the other thing that we don't talk about, so we talk about equal pay day and equal pay day relative to gender plus race and ethnicity, right? We just passed the date for Black women's equal pay day, which is the number of days into the next year that Black women have to work in order to be paid equitably to their white male peers, right? But one of the things that isn't talked about as often, right? So it's almost it's over 3/4 of a year, right? And we haven't even reached Latinas equal pay day. But one of the things that we know is that if you look at moms, and specifically breadwinner moms, and in the United States, moms are the breadwinners in 40% of U.S. households with children under the age of 18. And as a cohort, they have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the workforce. It's 66 cents on the dollar. I did this research. And then the second piece is if you look at that if you double click, like you were talking about, David, to gender plus race and ethnicity, we know that Black breadwinner moms have the largest gender pay gap of any women in the workforce. It's 44 cents on the dollar.
Oh my God.
And they support the majority of all Black children in the United States and have for over 40 years.
Wow. That's horrible.
You're not just impacting today's labor force, you're actually impacting your future labor force because the economic standing of parents is the top indicator of the future economic standing of children.
And let's not even talk about where this comes into play when we're talking about affirmative action and how that gives people not a leg up, but at least a chance of being able to be successful and have the opportunity to break those cycles. We're not talking about that today. We can't. We only have a half hour to talk about stuff.
There is a negative. I will say the one thing about affirmative action, we don't have to dive too far. I will tell you two things. One is there are predicted negative economic impact to the overturning of affirmative action. That's one. And the second is it wasn't about giving people a leg up. What it was about, which I'm not saying, David, that you were saying that, but just for folks listening, it was actually about recognizing people's different starting lines.
Oh, yeah.
And meeting them where they are.
Right.
And what the research shows is that, for instance, if you have a more privileged student with a certain GPA and a certain SAT score, and you take an underprivileged student or an underestimate, whatever, who doesn't come from that background with the same GPA and the same SAT, the economic bump is bigger for that underprivileged student.
Absolutely.
And that's what we've just wiped out.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
Let's go back to one of the other things you said before and start talking about the massive economic opportunity. And what do you mean exactly by gender equity is a massive economic opportunity?
Well, in the United States, we could add $3.1 trillion to the U.S. economy if we closed the gender equity gap. So that's not just the pay gap. The $512 billion I talked about is part of that. The other two pieces are labor force participation. Labor force participation is about half that number, a little less than half that number. So one of the things that we know is that women added $2 trillion to the U.S. economy from 1970 to 2016 through their increased labor force participation. Sure. But even though there's 58% of college graduates, there's still only 47% of the labor base, right? So increasing their labor force participation is part of that number. And then the last is actually dealing with occupational segregation. So it's actually, which is, for those who are like, that sounds like a really, what does that mean? That basically means that some occupations are female dominated and some are male dominated. And if we actually made that more equitable, we would get an economic bump from that.
Right. Just to kind of translate, if we talk about women in STEM, which has always been a problem, but now it's at least getting a focus where women are being recognized for their accomplishments in STEM in history, but also the fact that there is this kind of lack, whether it's lack of leadership, or whether it's, and when I say lack of leadership, lack of representation in leadership, not the lack of leadership from females in STEM, saying that there's lack of appropriate representation of females in the STEM-based occupations that then would enable people to say, hey, I'm just like her. Why can't I do that job? Because if you look at an About Us page of, some career site, and it's got the chief technology officer as this graying old white guy, well, that kind of disenfranchises a lot of people who say, well, I want to join that organization because that person doesn't represent me. Mm-hmm. But now if we start seeing people of color, women, other people who see themselves in there, right, then they actually can say, hey, that person represents me. I can succeed. I could be that person one day. Is that kind of does that resonate when you're talking about the opportunities?
It does. Yes. And what's interesting is actually women in STEM has gotten worse, not better, over the years. So if you look at it over the last 30 years, it's actually gotten worse. And so that's an issue. And it is a particular issue because during the pandemic, we actually leaped forward 5 years in terms of digital acceleration. And we can see it, with generative artificial intelligence now, but there's a lot of other technological advancements where if we don't have women with a seat at the table, the real concern is that right now we could hardwire our biases into the algorithms, right? Or we can hardwire them out. The choices are. So that's like the acute concern right now is that, right? And we've already seen some of that with ChatGPT and some of the other generative artificial intelligence tools, because it's without that equity lens, we're just basically spitting out our biases. The other piece is
we're going to replay our biases for the next 1,000 years,
and we will hardwire them in, because what happens with artificial intelligence is that it's intelligent. It is learning whatever you're feeding it. And so it starts to, the more of that you feed, the stronger it gets.
The worse it gets.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's because every time, for instance, ChatGPT generate, and not to call them out, they're not but they're the most commonly one, but when they generate artificial intelligence, that basically goes back into the engine and back into the engine. And back into the engine.
Getting recycled over and over and perpetuated more and more.
Yes.
Katica, think about this in another way. It's because we're training it from old thought, right? We don't know how to interact with the generative AI yet. We don't know how to ask it the right questions. We don't know how to feed it the right data until we learn. And then we learn what it's trying to tell us what to do. So in order for us to hopefully get to a better place, we need to tell it that treating people the same is a rule. It's like, when you watch that movie, I think it was the guy, and he was with his dog in Philadelphia, and he was a doctor, and he wanted to try and save the world, and he was the last person. Well, you need to have that same thought process of, you need that person to train it to do the right thing. You need to have that programmer to do the right thing and make sure it doesn't happen again, right?
Yeah, you need two pieces, and then I want to talk about the question around the if you can see it, you can be it. But you need two things. One is you need to understand where the biases are where they actually exist in the data set. That's one piece. And then the second is you need to actually ensure that the team that is developing and refining your algorithms is inclusive, so that you have those lived experiences so that they can both understand where the biases would be in that data, but also when they're programming and writing the algorithms, they understand how to code that to ensure that it's inclusive. So it's a both and in terms of ensuring that. And that's the real concern with the lack of gender equity, intersectional gender equity in tech and in artificial intelligence. One of the more acute concerns this year is that women make up about 26% of the tech workforce, but they've been 65% of the layoffs. So not only is it bad, it's actually particularly bad this year given the layoffs. The other thing that we find in terms of looking at the About Us page and not seeing someone who looks like yourself is that often we talk about the glass ceiling publicly as, has a woman ever had that role, right? And one of the things that we find is that the pipeline leaks early and often. So on average, that men are promoted at a rate of 21% greater than women. That's what we've found. And then, David, if you do that double click to gender plus race and ethnicity, we found that on average, men are promoted at a rate of 42% greater than Black women. So that About Us page, that inequity starts with that very first promotion. It's starting 20, 25 years earlier. That's really the crux of what we need to solve.
And you know, I think the important point is the stats that you're coming up with. You know, it seems like in recent years we've started to hear more and more about that inequity, but so often it's not coupled with the numbers, and so it kind of sits out in the ether. Yeah. Where now with what you're doing there, you're actually quantifying this. I mean, I'm flabbergasted as you're quoting these stats. I'm like, God, I knew it was there. I didn't realize it was that big. I didn't realize the impact was that big. So and I think that'll help to move the ball forward if we have a chance to move the ball forward.
Well, let's talk about moving the ball forward. What are some things that some companies are doing to actually fix this? You know, what are they doing right and what are they doing wrong?
96% of CEOs put equity in their top priorities, but only 22% of employees regularly see it shared and measured. So you have this 74-point gap between what CEOs and companies say is important, they're essentially their employer branding, and the actual employee experience. And what we have a lot of is awareness. So much so that we're getting some backlash, but there's a lot of awareness around this issue. Where it falls down is that there's not as much execution. So we've had a fair amount of what is often been called like checkbox diversity. So we send everyone through unconscious bias training. That's the most common one. Companies spend $8 billion a year on unconscious bias training. And what the data shows is not only does it not work, but it actually can make equity worse. It can make you less equitable because it reinforces stereotypes. And so what we really need to do is move to ensuring that the crux of it is our people decisions, right? So there are 5 people decisions that companies make, which is internal hiring, mobility, pay, performance, potential, and promotion. And there's 3 that they make across their employees each year, which is performance, potential, and pay. So for the average Fortune 500 company that has 60,000 employees, that's 180,000 opportunities to move toward equity each and every year. But bigger than that, what's also important is that's how we can actually leap forward toward equity.
So is there a solution, or is there something that we can do to get things right? And what have you seen for organizations that are getting things right?
Well, the companies that are moving toward equity are ensuring that their people decisions are equitable, and they're actually thinking more broadly about how they ensure equity within their organization through the decisions that they're making about their people and through the benefits that they're offering their people so that they're addressing the total labor force.
One of my colleagues and friends from early in my career started talking about DE&I as far as benefits go. and that is actually a difference in how people adopt benefits by the group that they're in, and making sure that we're trying to solve problems for all the different groups that we have in our organization by offering the right benefits to them. Do you see a lot of organizations that are changing the way they offer benefits to focus more on the diverse people that they have in their organization?
Well, really, it's more inclusive, I would say. That is, rather than offering benefits that we think people want, offering them the ones that they actually want. And I think the beginning of the movement toward that, it's my observation is that it's very much at its infancy. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's conversation around flexibility, right? So whether that's flexibility in remote work or whatever, women want flexibility. That's not necessarily true. So that's a hypothesis. It's not actually a research conclusion. So that's one thing. And the second is, I have said this, and I know other women who I know have said this, which is give me opportunity and I can pay for my flexibility.
Right.
The sort of idea that I don't need you to help. I can manage my life just fine on my own. What I need is opportunity. I think that's when we talk about the things that companies are doing, unconscious bias training being one, but a lot of it is around fixing the solutions that don't work, in addition to the checkbox diversity, are solutions that are focused on fixing the subjects of inequity. So women of color, et cetera. And the issue is that the system is not equitable by design. It is inequitable by default. So when we do things like send women to leadership development programs and teach them how to negotiate, or have them apply for more jobs, we're essentially saying it's a women problem, but they're actually in a system that doesn't value them equitably. We'd be much better from a systems perspective to actually ensure that the system is equitable by design rather than trying to fix the subjects of inequity.
And that takes more than just one employer. That takes the government, or it takes the culture to overcome those things.
I would say in technology. I would say technology. Culture can be a loaded word, to be honest with you. Like, yes, we want to have inclusive cultures, and yet that has been, like, oh, they're not a culture fit, has been used as a way to exclude people in the past. So culture can be, like, when you have a company that has a name for someone who exhibits their culture. So Google has Googlers, or Charles Schwab has Schwabies, not to call them out, just as examples that folks know. One of the things that we know is that women are held to account to demonstrate those cultural values to get ahead. Men are not. They can, but it doesn't matter if they do in order for them to be promoted. So that's one example of where, like, culture, yes, we need to have inclusive cultures, but it can be a bit of a loaded word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That sucks.
It makes total sense. It totally sucks.
Hey, are you listening to this and thinking to yourself, man, I wish I could talk to David about this? Well, you're in luck. We have a special offer for listeners of the HR Data Labs podcast. A free half-hour call with me about any of the topics we cover on the podcast, or whatever is on your mind. Go to salary.com/HRDL consulting to schedule your free 30-minute call today.
Would it be safe to say that kind of a starting point for that, because you talked about the systems, and I can definitely see that. Do we start at the point of awareness? Is that a starting point to really start to move that ball, or what would you say is the starting point with that?
Making the system. So what we know from behavioral science, so sort of separate from the equity conversation, is just human behavior, right? So if you look at it from a human behavior perspective, what we know is that the system will trump the individual every single time. So if you want to change human behavior, you have to change the system that humans are in.
Sure.
Right. And that's why a lot of diversity solutions don't work is because they're trying to fix the people, but they're not fixing the system. If we fix the system, then what happens is, like, I've managed thousands of people in my career, right? Obviously very committed to equity, breadwinner mom who fought to be paid equitably twice and won. And yet in those systems, I had to choose to be equitable. We need to change the system where if it is equitable by design, then I'm choosing to be inequitable.
Right.
That's the way that you actually move it forward. And that's what we haven't done. And that's why the solutions haven't been successful.
Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. I think what I'm wondering about is, how do I know, in the context of changing the system, how do I know where to start with that? And I'm wondering if it's sort of an awareness of what's actually broken in the system, and
I think we've done
how
a lot
you
of
utilize
that, though.
it. Okay.
To be honest, like, we have done a lot of that, right? So we've seen from the end of 2019 to the end of 2022, there was a 174% increase in companies that signed public pledges committed to equity. Mm-hmm. You know, we've seen a lot of awareness, and awareness is great, but awareness is not execution.
Sure.
Awareness is not changing the system. And so what we need to do are people decisions, as one example. That's not the only example. Our benefits as another example. We need to ensure that those are equitable by default, or equitable by design, rather than inequitable by default. I'll give you a public policy example, which is that in the United States, the Equal Pay Act was signed into law by President Kennedy in 1963. But still,
and yet here we are.
Right. And the reason is that the only way that works is if I am experiencing pay inequity, I have to speak up.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And by definition, if I am experiencing inequity, I am not in a position of power, because why would I do that to myself? So our system is still inequitable by default. Sure. That's the issue, rather than, for instance, companies proving that they're paying people equitably, because it's a cost to the American taxpayer, as an example. And that's just one public policy example. But that's where, if we actually want equity, let's fix the system.
Sure.
But the good news is there is some hope, and pay transparency laws are meant to at least give the information and make information more ubiquitous, so that people who are making those decisions can at least have a more level playing field, and there are no more bargains. I pray there are no more bargains where people say, well, I don't know, why don't we just pay me what I got paid before, or a little bit more? Mm-hmm. That just makes things worse, not better. But now with pay transparency, at least there's that representation of understanding with the candidate as to what it is that pay range might be for that job. I'm not saying it's the solution. I'm saying that from a public policy perspective, Katica, it's actually getting to there slowly.
It's a guardrail. It's a step forward.
Yeah, it is.
But it's not. Yeah, I mean, Colorado, which is where I live, was the first state in the union to have pay transparency. I was one of two expert witnesses for the state legislature, and the only economic expert witness. So I am an advocate for pay transparency. What pay transparency is, like, it's the name we've given it, but we're not really making everyone's pay transparent. We're really making a pay range transparent, right? So it's a step forward, and it provides guardrails, and that's good. There's still more solutions in that. Yeah. The other thing I would just add is, and I think, pay has gotten a fair amount of airtime because it's a number, and we can quantify it, and we can say it quickly, and people can understand it. One of the things that we know is that pay is the symptom, it's not the disease. So in other words, pay is the quantitative value that we place on our talent, but the actual value comes before that in performance and potential.
Right.
And so we have to ensure, for instance, that our performance reviews are equitable, that our performance ratings are equitable, that we're actually developing talent equitably for those future roles. So for instance, when you're talking about the CTO, that the pipeline of folks who are essentially the bench that we're creating to take on those roles is equitable. They're getting those highly visible, meaty assignments that would put them in line to actually take those roles.
I would go back a step and say the candidate experience as well, and making sure that one is fair so that the people who actually come into our organization or the people who are inviting in to interview, that should be fairer as well. And hiring them for the right roles, not just a role, not just a junior role. They should be hired for the role that they're qualified for.
And that's also something that's different between men and women. So we judge men on their future potential, which is a pattern matching, right? Because we pattern match them to someone who's currently in that role. And the majority of all leaders in corporations are men. And we judge women based on their past performance. So we're more likely to put men into a future leadership role, or David, to your point, to actually think of hiring them for a position than we are to do that with women.
When I was talking about culture, that's what's got to change. That crap, that bullshit, pardon my French. It's got to change. We got to stop being those people.
Which then we have to change the system so that you're choosing. Like, so let's say we were all interviewing for the same role, right? Then David, if you were, or maybe Dwight and I are interviewing for the same role, and David, you're the hiring manager, that by default, Dwight and I are included in that pool, and you would have to choose to exclude me.
Unless the damn AI excludes you first.
Right. Which goes back to like ensuring that, right? Yeah, for sure. But yeah.
Well,
but that's what I mean.
Katica
like
can't be in that role because she's female, and we've seen the pattern shows over the last.
And we've seen that, right? Like Amazon had a hiring app that did that very thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it goes back to your point before, Katica. We've got to make sure that the algorithms are being programmed by the people who it's supposed to serve, and a representative sample of the people, so we can look at it critically and make sure we're doing the damn right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Katica, it was a pleasure having you. Thank you so much. You're awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been great having you on. This is fascinating.
Yeah. We could sit here and listen to your numbers all day, by the way. We love that stuff. We're numbers.
You can tell we're data geeks,
Totally.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's where I spend most of my life. My brain works in numbers, right? That's how I think, right? So, and I'm a researcher by trade, so I have hypotheses, and then I figure out whether or not they're true. So,
and we love that. Well, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll get you back on to talk about how much progress we've made in a very short period of time.
That would be great.
Thank you very much. Dwight, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. This has been fascinating.
And thank you all for listening. Take care and stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.